Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for our third in our series of Educator webinars sponsored by Plymouth State University. We are so glad to have you here today. There are still many of you coming in, but we are going to begin in just a few short moments. Again, the title of our presentation today is My Students, Your Students, Our Students, the Promise of Inclusive Special Education. And I am so pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sara Scribner. And with that, we hope you have a great time and thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. We know everyone's schedule in life is super busy, so we're so glad you're here joining us. Our plan for this afternoon, we'll do some brief introductions. Then we're going to take a short look at disability history, just a really quick peek at some of the sort of key moments connected to special education. Then we're going to look a little bit at the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're going to consider some different models for looking at disability. Then we're going to start to think about, what do we mean by inclusive education? This is a term we hear a lot, but what does it mean in terms of pedagogy and practice? Then we're going to do some facts or myths related to inclusive education. And then we will sort of round up the day by looking at some upcoming offerings at PSU and leave some time for questions, comments, and closing thoughts. That being said, the Q&A is open and being monitored across this webinar. So as questions come up, please feel free to put them in the Q&A at any point in time. We'll have some moments where we'll sort of pause and check that and be making sure that we're answering them as we go. So feel free to jump in with questions at any point in time. As I'm introducing myself, we would also love to know who you all are joining us today. So the chat is open if you would like to do any introductions. Some potential things you might want to share, what brought you to the webinar, your professional role, where you're geographically located, how familiar you are with disability history and/or inclusive education, or anything else that you might feel like sharing to introduce yourself with the group. Chat is disabled. Okay, we thought we had fixed that. Thank you. We'll work on that. Okay, a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. Sara Scribner. It's so nice to be here with you all. A little bit about me professionally. I'm a former inclusive special educator, so I worked with students across a variety of age ranges, sort of my youngest being second graders. I taught fourth grade, sixth grade, 11th and 12th graders, as well as students in the 18 to 21-year-old sort of segment. I also do a lot of work as an inclusive education consultant, working with schools and thinking about how we can create more inclusive opportunities for students. I love to think about inclusive best practices, differentiation, co-teaching, and collaboration, how we meaningfully assess students, supporting students with challenging behavior in the classrooms, supporting social justice-oriented educators. That picture of me has coffee. I love coffee, just a little bit of a human fact about myself. And then also a bit more about me, sort of professionally. I love orange. I went to Syracuse University for all of my degrees. So my PhD is in inclusive special education. I have a CAS in disability studies. I have a master's in inclusive special education for students with multiple and severe disabilities. And my bachelor's was in inclusive elementary and special education. I'm an assistant professor here at Plymouth State, and I also coordinate our MED programs in special education. And as I said, I do a lot of collaboration with schools and districts to think about how we can support students with disabilities, including those students with more complex support needs and/or challenging behavior in inclusive classrooms. So I love to still also get to do a lot of work on the ground with schools, thinking about how we can best support kids. So I'm super happy to be here with you. Thanks again for joining. Okay, we're first going to situate ourselves just in a little bit of disability history. This is, of course, super brief. There's a lot more that we could explore, but we only have an hour for everything, so this will be quick. But I wanted to sort of have us situate education and special education within larger disability history as we get started. And so we're going to go back. We're going to start in the 1800s. And that was the period in US history where we started institutionalizing folks with disabilities. So there was a large movement often framed around sort of helping and kind of places that provide the best services, right, for folks with disabilities being institutions. And so there was an institutionalization movement, right? And oftentimes families were really encouraged by professionals to consider institutionalized settings for their children and loved ones. In the late 1800s, we saw the eugenics movement begin. I don't know how familiar we are with eugenics, but the eugenics movement was really focused around sort of genes, right? And the fitter families, right? The best genes. And so, of course, disability coming from a eugenics framework was not desirable, right? And so we also sort of see that adding to how disability is framed in terms of really seeing disability as deficit, right? And undesirable traits that we don't want to be passing along through our genetic lineage. Um, and so sort of institutionalization and eugenics really took off in the 1800s and continued well into the 1900s. So we're going to jump up a little bit as those is sort of the background. And in 1945, we saw sort of as a first initiative from Truman to start to think about the experience of folks with disabilities. We saw National Employ the Handicapped Week, right? Thinking about job opportunities for folks with disabilities. Jumping up a little bit further, and again, this is a brief blip of history, but we saw the first time that JFK appointed a panel on mental retardation in the federal government to start thinking about those conditions. We also, of course, know the Kennedy family connection to disability and Rosemary Kennedy, who was institutionalized herself. Sort of around that same time period, really in the mid-1960s, we start to see a big push to end institutionalization. So the deinstitutionalization movement really starts to sort of take off within our country. Some sort of big moments in that. In 1966, Burton Blatt published Christmas in Purgatory, and it was a book with a lot of images from the institutionalized experience of folks with disabilities that are pretty horrific to look at. And then in 1972, soon thereafter, Geraldo Rivera did an expose on the conditions at Willowbrook State School, bringing more attention to the conditions and the experiences that folks were undergoing in these different institutionalized settings. Around the same time, we see our first Special Olympics in 1968. The first one was already 1,000 athletes. And then as we get closer to sort of starting to think about education, of course, all across this time period, folks with disabilities could be excluded from public schools. And so it was really focused around this idea of mental age, right? And so if you were not deemed to have a mental age of 5 or more, right, you could be excluded from public education. And so in 1971, we saw a group of parents kind of take on the state of Pennsylvania wanting public school access for their children. There was 13 families in total that were really advocating for free and appropriate public education for their children as well. And so kind of what came out of that case was that some of those state laws were declared unconstitutional, right? We see that first push to really start to evaluate and thinking about placing students with disabilities or more complex support needs in public education. Around the same time period, we see Section 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act coming out in 1973. That's, of course, a civil rights related law that does provide accommodations for folks with disabilities. And then in 1975, we had our first law that required schools to provide a free and public education for students with disabilities, which was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So if we sort of situate sort of public school access for all students with disabilities, we're really looking at only the last 50 years of our national history where this was required by law. And then in 1990, we saw the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, sorry, I have a typo there, being passed, right? So there's some pictures there from the Capitol crawl on the right side. And we also saw the Education for All Handicapped Children Act become the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, which we know of today as IDEA. So those were both passed. In 2004, we had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, which was the last reauthorization of IDEA. And in 2010, we saw Rose's Law passed, which did change all of our federal language from mental retardation to intellectual disability. And so again, this is really brief. These are just sort of some key moments in disability history, very limited, but really to think through how disability was framed and treated for a lot of our history, and then sort of situating public education within that for the last about 50 years, right, in terms of public school access. So, as we just said, the IDEA is a federal education law. So, unlike the ADA and Section 504, right, which are more civil rights focused, this is really connected to education. It was last reauthorized in 2004. So, we are working with a legal framework, a law, right, that is at 20 years old at this point. And this legislation aims to ensure that students with disabilities can't be denied a public education, right? So really kind of coming out of that PARC fight where students before that were not allowed in, we're now saying, nope, irregardless of the disability, we can't deny them a public education. And so all students are welcome in public schools. And that's really the purpose of IDEA. All right. Again, this is just a little visual of sort of that some of that timeline. 73, we have Section 504, 75, that Education for All Handicapped Children Act, 1990, with the IDEA and the ADA, our amendments and our reauthorization. So the first thing that's important to know about IDEA specifically, which is sort of different from how we think about disability broadly, is that the IDEA has 13 federal categories for qualification for special education services and supports. And so in order for a student to qualify for special education, they have to be identified within one of these 13 federal categories, and their disability has to have adverse educational effects, right? So it has to be impacting sort of their access and ability to access education. And so we have 13 federal categories that include autism, intellectual disability, specific learning disability, emotional disturbance, other health impairment, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, hearing impairment, deafness, visual impairment, including blindness, deafblindness, orthopedic impairment, and multiple disabilities. And then up until age 9, under federal law, students can also qualify for special education under the category of developmental delay. And so there's a visual on the right side of the screen that shows sort of school-age children 5 through 21 served by IDEA and the categories that they fall into. And so we can see specific learning disability is by far the largest category. So 34.9% of students who qualify for special education qualify under the category of specific learning disability. The next largest category is speech or language impairment, which 17.8% of students with disabilities qualify under, so almost half of that specific learning disability category. From there, we have other health impairment, which is 16.5% of students who qualify, and that is a category where students who have some different diagnoses could potentially qualify for special education. So it's kind of that other category. So that might be a category where students with ADHD, for example, could potentially qualify for special education if we're seeing adverse educational effects, right? Then we have students with autism, 11.6% of our population within special education. Intellectual disability is 6.1%, emotional disturbance 5.2%, and then all other disability categories combined are 7.9%. So that includes our traumatic brain injury, hearing impairment, deafness, right? Orthopedic impairments. All of those other categories are just under 8% of all students who qualify. So if you're a teacher in a public school, you're often going to see students qualifying most often under specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, right? Other health impairment. Those are sort of our big three. Do you have a question? I see you popping in, Jeremy.
Well, we just have one question, and I don't speak the abbreviation, but the question is, and you said it just a moment ago, is it 1413 plus DD? Not sure what that is, but
Yeah. So there's 13 federal categories broadly. Great question. And then you can also qualify under developmental disability just until age 9, which is why it's not sort of a broad 14th category. It's a great question. It's a little confusing. Thank you for asking that. And so at age 9, right, you would have to decide, does the student now qualify under one of the other 13 federal categories, or do they no longer qualify for special education? And so that's sort of a decision point for younger students, for teams to make decisions about. Great question. So as we're thinking about IDEA, right, we have students who are qualifying and they have to qualify under one of these 13 federal categories. And the adverse educational effects is really important, right? Because a student, for example, may have autism. It's just the first one on my list here. They might have autism and they might be doing really well in school without supports and services, right? And so they would not automatically qualify for special education because they have autism. It's really looking at how disability is impacting their educational access to begin thinking about the qualification process. There's also a large referral process that we go through to qualify students, which we're not going to cover today. But it's a pretty in-depth process. And so we have students who are qualifying here under our 13 federal categories. And so that sort of is who we're thinking about when we think about who is covered by IDEA. The IDEA has 6 really sort of key principles that it guarantees to students and families, and we're going to talk about each one of those things. The first is FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. The second is appropriate non-discriminatory evaluation. The third is LRE, or least restrictive environment. The fourth is an IEP, an individualized education plan. The fifth, parent and student participation. And the sixth, procedural safeguards. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those, what each one of those mean. So the first principle of IDEA is FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. It basically means exactly what it sounds like. It says that all students, regardless of their disability, should receive a free education that's appropriate, right? It appropriately meets their needs, provided by their local public education system, right? So the town that a student lives in can't say, no, we can't service you, right? Like we're not going to provide you an education. And they also can't charge parents, right, to be providing whatever that child might need in terms of educational access. No cost to the parents, right, or to the family or to the guardian. So the idea is that all students get what they need from their local school district. School districts, of course, might make decisions to have them served from other particular places, but it still falls on that local district to be the providers of that free and appropriate public education. The second sort of key principle of IDEA says that students who qualify under IDEA are provided with an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. And so an IEP is going to outline things like their present levels of performance, including their strengths and their areas of need. It's going to have some measurable annual goals in it. So really thinking about what are the things this student needs to work on this year to start kind of building up their skills and potentially closing some of those gaps between where they're at in general education. It's going to outline special education services and related services that they might qualify for. It's going to have accommodations and modifications for them outlined. If they are 14 or older, they're going to have transition planning and transition related goals for students. We're also going to see progress monitoring in there. So thinking about how often the parents get updates on those annual goals, which has to be at least as often as students without IEPs get progress reports. It's going to have testing accommodations, right? It's going to have a lot of different things. So it really puts together a plan that is specific to that particular student based off their current strengths and areas of need to support them within their education. Oop, I'm pressing buttons. I apologize. Our IEPs have to be, by federal law, reviewed and updated every year. And the student has to be reevaluated to make sure that they still qualify for special education every 3 years. Another key piece of IDEA are the procedural safeguards. Those include things like the right for parents to see all records related to their child, the right to an impartial hearing if they're in disagreement with what's being proposed, the right to receive prior notices so that they're not going to a meeting and being surprised about what's being proposed by the district. The right to engage in mediation to try to work through potentially different perspectives on what their child's education might look like. The right to have an attorney, the right to move to a state level appeal if unsatisfied with what's going on at the local education authorities kind of hearing level. So there's a lot of procedural safeguards in place to try to protect the rights of students and their families within these processes connected to special education. Another key part of IDEA is parent and student participation. So some key parts related to this. One, one really key piece is that parents have the right to give consent. And so if a parent says, no, my child cannot be evaluated, right, that is the end of consideration for special education at that point. Unless it goes to due process, right? But they have the right to consent kind of throughout the process, and they have the right to participate in every part of the educational process for their child in connection to special education. Sort of within the intent of the law, parents are meant to be co-equal members of the team, right? So their knowledge of their child and their perspective are very important and should be considered within the process and the discussions. And then the law also says that when appropriate, the student has the right to participate in the same ways as their parents. And so there's a lot of sort of difference in how that part is often interpreted or sort of utilized by districts, right? When is it appropriate for a student to participate and come and maybe speak at or participate in IEP meetings, providing input on sort of their educational needs or things that would be useful for them. But in particular, often as students get older, they become participators in this process. The IDEA also outlines and guarantees appropriate evaluation, right? And so this means that the evaluations used to qualify a student for special education need to be appropriate. We need to be using multiple varied assessments, right? So we're not going to make a decision about special education based off of one assessment. They should be, when possible, right, in the student's native language, that we're not assessing English language acquisition, but really thinking about disability. They should be evaluations that are non-discriminatory with non-biased procedures, right? So we're going to be using a lot of standardized measures to think through, does the student qualify for special education or not? And then the last key principle of IDEA would be the least restrictive environment, or we often call that LRE. And this one's really important when we start to think about inclusive service delivery for students with disabilities. And the LRE says that each public agency must ensure that, one, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled, and two, special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And so what the law is really saying is that, right, to the maximum extent appropriate, that language is a little bit gray, but children with disabilities should be educated with their non-disabled peers, right? So there's some leaning towards those opportunities for inclusivity. And it's really saying that in order to consider more restrictive placements, right, special classes, separate schools, or other removal, we need to know that the student couldn't be successful in the regular class with the use of supplementary aids and services. And so that language is really important, right? Because we have to, how do we know if a student could be successful in general education if we've never sort of tried to support them in that setting? And so the law does lean towards supporting inclusive learning opportunities. It does not demand them, right? Especially with that language around to the maximum extent appropriate. That's a bit gray, right? How do we know what's the maximum extent possible? Another really important thing, though, sort of based off of case law, right, is that the law does not support students being placed in specific programs based on a disability label, right? And so the idea, for example, that a student with autism is automatically placed in a program for students with autism is not the intent here, right? Because this is supposed to be an individualized education for each individual student, really connected to their strengths and needs, and really thinking about, can we support them in less restrictive settings before considering a more restrictive placement? And the other thing that's really important to remember in connection to IDEA is that special education is a service, right? It is a service being provided to a student. It's not a place or a particular program. And so it really is about individualized education and not about fitting students into existing programming, right? And so the idea is, how do we get these services and supports in place that a student needs, which is really supportive of starting to think about inclusive options for students. And so we're going to now think a little bit about some sort of shifting views on disability that are in line with kind of inclusive shifts in educational spaces. And so one model of disability, and this one is very much sort of where our institutionalization movements, our eugenics movements were situated, right? And even still a lot of our discourse in a lot of spaces. So one model of disability is called the medical model of disability. And in the medical model, the problem is really situated within the individual, right? And so when we come at something from a medical model, right, we're really seeing sort of these impairments that an individual person has. Maybe they're physical, maybe they're mental, maybe they're sensory. And so within that kind of viewpoint, we have this individual who has impairments. And so that's the problem, right? We now have all of these individual problems. And so a lot of times from a medical model perspective, then the emphasis or the goal becomes curing, alleviating the effects of the disability, remediating, right, those impairments. So really focused on sort of what's the problem and how do we fix it is a very traditional sort of medical model approach to disability. And a lot of disability activists and advocates, self-advocates, have very much pushed back on this model. And so we've also developed, there's a lot of conversation around the social model of disability. And so this one looks at disability a little bit differently. From a social model of disability, we see a person who's sort of navigating the world, right, and is experiencing all sorts of barriers. And so when we start to think about those social barriers through the social model, right, we might notice, for example, that the environment is inaccessible. So maybe it's the physical buildings, maybe it's the language being used, maybe it's the services being offered, maybe it's the communication modes or styles are inaccessible to a person, right? So those create barriers for their access. Maybe we're seeing attitudes as being barriers. Maybe folks are going out into the world and experiencing prejudice or stereotyping or discrimination, and those are creating barriers to them being able to access and navigate. Maybe we're also seeing organizations as being inflexible, right, in their procedures or practices. And so maybe those are creating barriers that someone is experiencing as they're out navigating in the world. And so in a social model of disability, we're no longer saying what's wrong with this individual person, but we're starting to look and see what are all the barriers, right? And how do we start just removing barriers broadly so that access is more equitable and available for everyone. And so there are two very different perspectives in terms of sort of how disability is viewed and sort of what the end goal is, right? A medical model is very much about how do we fix or remediate this person. A social model perspective very much thinks about how do we change this environment to create more access for anyone who might interact with it. And so this sort of shifting viewpoints of disability have very much been a part of our movements towards more inclusive special education service delivery for students with disabilities. So if we kind of think back, right, exclusion is definitely we think back to institutionalization as one example broadly, right? There was very much a time and space in our society where exclusion of folks with disabilities was very much the norm. But exclusion kind of is folks with disabilities, right? Outside of or away from society at large, or outside of our general education classrooms. Then we've seen segregation models, right? We very much still have some of these models in schools, right? Where we sort of have classrooms in general. And then we also have other classrooms where all of the students with disabilities might be serviced and educated, sort of in those separate spaces. Sometimes in schools, we see integration models where students with disabilities might be in a general education classroom, but perhaps are still sort of working just with a special educator, right? Just kind of around and with other students with disabilities. So that would be integration, kind of in the space, but still separate. And so a lot of parents these days are advocating for inclusion, which means that their student with a disability is included within the general education classroom and receiving their education services and supports alongside their same age neighborhood peers, right? And so we see the inclusion model here where the students with disabilities are very much just sort of in with all of the other dots representing various students. And so we're now going to sort of shift gears and think a little bit about what is inclusive education and some of the potential myths or facts related to it and the research around inclusive education. Are there any questions before we keep rolling? I want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
You are doing a tremendous job. There have not been many questions. I might encourage our participants to really expand the scope of perhaps some of this is known to them, but feel free to expand the scope about what is your experience working with students in this area and what questions might you have. It doesn't necessarily have to be directly related to Dr. Scribner's talk, but we thank you so much for being here and please continue.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Thank you. All right, and so inclusion is sort of a buzzword right now in education, right? There's a lot of push for inclusion. And a lot of times when I go into classrooms where people say it's inclusive, there's a lot of people working really hard, right? And what I see are students in a room and sort of not a lot of supports and maybe sometimes not a lot of intentionality beyond that, right? Like we have bodies in the room, but now what? And so it's really important to know and think about the fact that inclusion really starts with pedagogy, right? Or core beliefs that really should drive our inclusive service delivery. And so when we think about an inclusive pedagogy, it really starts with the idea that all students belong, no matter what, right? All students belong in that classroom space, irregardless of disability or other identity factors, right? They all belong. They all should be there. Oh, why does my mouse keep doing that? I apologize. It also is centered around the idea that all students can and will make meaningful contributions to all that's happening in a classroom, right? And so while students may make different contributions, an inclusive pedagogy really centers the idea that all students have something to offer, right? They belong and they have something to offer that's going to add to the classroom community and learning environment. Inclusive pedagogy also really believes that all students are capable of learning, right? And so while students may learn in different ways or need different supports to learn in the ways that work best for them, inclusion really believes that all students can learn, irregardless of disability label or presentation, right? And that they should have access to grade level content and curriculum. And so central to this inclusive pedagogy is this idea, right, that students need to have some access to grade level content and curriculum as well, not based off of sort of qualifying for it because they've shown, certain academic skills or progress. Inclusive pedagogy also really values the diversity that all learners bring to a community, right? We're talking about disability specifically here, but all learners are diverse in different ways, and that diversity adds to and really strengthens the classroom community. And within an inclusive pedagogy, right, we're no longer looking at normalcy, right? Like, oh, they're normal, they're not. That's normal, that's not. And we're no longer thinking about how are we going to fix this student, right? But more so, how are we really going to harness this student's strengths and work with them in the classroom? An inclusive pedagogy believes that we should be creating space and learning opportunities that work for a wide range of learners, right? So sort of one size fits all learning is no longer a part of an inclusive pedagogy. And it also really emphasizes or requires us to think about how do we utilize all adults so that we can meaningfully engage all of the learners in this space and learning. And so those are just some of the core pieces of inclusion. But it really starts with these core beliefs, right? If you don't start with these beliefs, it's really hard to then engage in the practices that make inclusion actually work and happen in ways that support learners. And so we have inclusive pedagogy, right? We sort of have these core beliefs about what inclusion is and what inclusion adds to our learning spaces. And our inclusive pedagogy then informs practices, right? And so schools that really have embraced an inclusive pedagogy, we often see things like they're hiring people who are committed to inclusive education, right? We're bringing staff together who can support this. We see practices like intentionally built classroom community, right? We see teachers who are really using community builders. So they're highlighting student strengths. We see classroom communities that really highlight all of those different students who are there and bring them into the space. When we see pedagogy kind of in practice and informing practices, we see co-planned and co-taught curriculum. So no longer do we have a general educator working in one lane, kind of doing their thing, and a special educator doing something a bit different. We see how they're bringing those two people together to design instruction for all students. We see things like ownership by all adults of all students, right? No longer are we hearing about my students and your students or the general ed students and the IEP students, right? In inclusive spaces, all students are everyone's students. We also see things like differentiated learning opportunities. We see opportunities for all members of the classroom community to engage, to participate, and to show what they know. And so we see teachers who are getting really creative to construct opportunities for students to demonstrate their knowledge and their learning. We see a lot of intentional adaptations, right? We see a lot of accommodations and modifications to increase access to general education. We see change making, right, in space to better meet the needs of all of the members of the classroom. So this isn't working, right? How are we going to change this and make it work? We see a lot of humanistic, individualized behavior supports for students in inclusive spaces, kind of backed by that inclusive pedagogy. And another thing that's really sort of a key practice related to inclusion are those high expectations for all learners, because we believe that all students can and will learn, right, when given the opportunity to do so. And so kind of when that pedagogy is informing our practice, we see classroom spaces where the bar is set really high for all learners. All right. So I'm going to switch screens here for one sec.
And while you're doing that, we do have one question that came in a little bit ago, and I'm going to try to sum it up as you're switching that. There was a graph a little bit ago that was talking about the percentage of different disabilities, and it stated that it was from 2020. I believe the questioner is asking if you have any data that, and if you recall this particular slide, if you have any data that shows how that may have changed over the past 4 years, particularly in autism and OHI.
So all districts have to report data to the federal government every year, and it comes out in an IDEA report to Congress every year. So this year's is the 44th annual report to Congress on IDEA, and there's always a delay in the sort of data collection and the output of the report. And so that data is the most recent publicly available data. But I can tell you in the past 10 years, autism rates have about tripled. Went from about 3% 10 years ago to now we're up around 10. I can go back. Let me Let me go back. I apologize. Share. I think we were talking. Yeah, so autism is at 11.6%. And 10 years ago, it was just over 3%. And other health impairment, OHI, has been pretty consistent in terms of numbers. I'd have to go back and pull the other reports for the exact data. But in a couple of years, the current data will be out. There's just a delay between the collection time and when the reports come out, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, sorry for sidetracking you, but thank you so much for the clarification.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. See if this is going to work. This is an experiment for me with technology. So now if you would like to join in, any like pushback to or claims that you hear about inclusive education, what are people saying about it? If you would like to join at slido.com, we're number 3652096, or there's also a QR code that could be scanned, but you're welcome to send in things that you're hearing about inclusive education. Oh, cool. Someone's typing. This is fun.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest with that prompt.
Yes, there is. These are great. I hear many of these. It's not needed, not enough time to plan for all students, not enough adults interested with the pay. As we know, teachers are not paid as well as they should be. Sometimes students may be disruptive to peers. We need training. Whose responsibility is it? Does it really work? Time consuming. I hear that one a lot. Not enough support for the higher needs students, not enough staff. Great. These are great. Not enough support staff. I hear all of these all the time. Okay. I'm going to jump this back. Thanks for sending those in. Those are very much in line with what I often hear as well. And I pulled some of the ones I hear most commonly for us to think about together. So you're welcome to sort of think about whether we think this is a myth or a fact. So I often hear inclusive education can or will only benefit certain students. Our chat is not open currently, right?
No, our chat does appear to be open. In fact,
It is. Okay,
yeah. In
great.
fact, one of the questions is, what do teachers do when they don't have any support in the classroom? Which is a lot of fun.
Great. Okay, great. We got one myth vote coming through. Awesome. So this one, I've got a few more coming in. Myth. Great. Yeah, so this one is a myth. This idea that inclusive education will only be beneficial to certain students. And according to the research, really across sort of disability labels, age ranges, etc., all students can benefit from inclusive access to general education classrooms, right? The research also shows that there's not sort of minimum prerequisite skills that are required for students to be able to benefit from inclusive education. And research also shows that students considered to have more significant disabilities, more complex support needs, right, have increased educational gains in inclusive classroom settings, right? And so there's a lot more to that, but the research really shows that they're getting access to grade level peers, right? They're getting access to high quality, rigorous curriculum, right? They're getting all of the support sort of built into the classroom. And so the research really shows that all students, irregardless of kind of their disability or how they might be perceived in relation to their disability, can benefit from access to the general education classroom. Okay, another one, this also came up, I think, in ours a little bit. Inclusive classrooms take away from the learning of non-identified general education students. Myth or fact? We're good at this.
I
So
should
this,
have asked if I was allowed to vote. I'm sorry.
you're allowed to vote. Sure, anyone can vote. So there's been a lot of research on this as well, and it's important to note, I didn't say this, but there's over 40 years of research on inclusive education at this point, right? There's a lot of decades worth of research. And so the research shows that at worst, for students without disabilities, there's a neutral impact in inclusive classrooms. So there's some research that says they do experience academic achievement, social, right? Like all sorts of benefits from inclusive classrooms. And then sort of at worst, the research shows that in some cases it was neutral, right? Like they just sort of were the same as where they would have been with or without the inclusive classroom. At best, right, inclusive classrooms support academic, social, and other gains for all students in the classroom, regardless of disability label. And so a lot of the research talks about the ways in which, for example, if you're in a co-taught differentiated classroom, even if you do not have a disability, you're often benefiting from that differentiation, the other adults in the room, the smaller groups, right? All of the things that are built in to make a space inclusive. And the research really shows that students with and without disabilities learn skills from sharing that classroom space with one another that benefit them far beyond the classroom. So sort of those social connection, sort of the ways in which students view disability, right? There are a lot of sort of interpersonal and social benefits as well beyond the academics or the potential for academic benefits for students. Myth or fact number 3, separate special education classrooms provide environments that better meet the needs of students with disabilities. I hear this one a lot. It is also a myth. So there's been a lot of research looking at sort of separate classrooms where students with disabilities might be placed. And some of the findings include separate classrooms often provide much higher levels of distraction than the general education classroom. That may be related to sort of behavior, noise levels, other sort of sensory input opportunities, right? All sorts of different factors, but they're often far more distracting, even if there's far less students in them than general education classrooms. They often tend to provide sort of less academic rigor, and there's often far less access to grade level connected sort of curriculum and education, right? So oftentimes the curriculum is very different in separate classrooms from some level of push-in or inclusive settings. Oftentimes the research shows that separate classrooms provide some negative behavior models for students, right? Oftentimes, for example, we take a lot of students who have a hard time sometimes with their behavior. And so now they're all in the same space, having a hard time with behavior and sort of watching and modeling for one another. There's also research that shows that separate classrooms really do not support the social growth of the students placed in them, right? So they're missing those same age peers to engage in social interactions with in sort of age appropriate, developmentally appropriate ways. And so there's a lot less social growth in separate classrooms. And there's often sort of less of a sense of community in separate classrooms, according to the research. Smaller settings, sort of different maybe structure or pace to them. And so sort of that community feeling is often missing from these spaces as well. All right. Another one, myth or fact, students with disabilities make better academic gains in separate classrooms. So this is very much connected to our last one, myth number 3. But right, the research shows that often the sort of rigor of the curriculum is very different in separate settings, and have a lot of factors that can hinder learning, like distractions, right, and sort of negative behavior models. And so the research also really shows, this doesn't really sound complicated, but it is documented in the research, the more access to grade level content students have, the greater academic gains they make, sort of parallel to grade level content expectations, right? So the more you're in 4th grade ELA, the more access you have to it, and the more likely you are to perform kind of close to or in alignment with those expectations. And so research really shows that students make far better educational gains in inclusive classroom spaces. And in those spaces, students are supported through differentiated instruction, right, and effective co-teaching models in the research. Often sort of the ways in which we can create accessible curriculum very much adds to academic gains for students with disabilities, even if they're not on grade level, right, in terms of kind of where they're currently performing. Okay, and so this one is the last one I have for us to think about. Inclusive education is more expensive than traditional approaches. And I'm going to say expensive in terms of funds and in terms of personnel. This one is a myth. So according to the research, inclusion can really be done with the same budget or less, and it's usually about restructuring resources. And inclusion usually supports kind of a more effective or most effective use of all of the adults available within a school building, right? So it's about taking the folks that we have often and reusing them in different ways to support inclusive education. And I have a little visual for us to look at to think about this. So this is one classroom, elementary school classroom, and this was just one classroom sort of pre-inclusion shifts. And so we see here, this was the classroom teacher. Along the sides and the bottom were all of the students. This one also identifies students by race. So the W stands for white students, the AA stands for African American students, the AS stands for Asian students, and the L stands for Latino or Latina students. And we see up here all of the different service providers. So we have 2 special ed teachers. Oh, I'm so sorry, my mouse. We have a speech and language provider. We have OT, PT, a reading specialist, and an ESL teacher. And so that was the term the school used. And so we see here all of these students, and these were students who were pulled out for services. Leaving. So we see like the student goes to 1, 2, 3, 4 different providers. The student goes to 3, right? We can see sort of all these lines of pullout that were happening in this particular classroom for students to go see all of their different providers. Large scale, this was what the building looked like before they shifted to an inclusive model. And so we had sort of K classrooms here, 1 classrooms here, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. So there was there was 1 4th grade inclusion classroom that had 20 general education students and 10 students with disabilities. So that was 1 full-time special educator. And then we had 3 resource teachers who were all servicing 5-ish classrooms. Right? So that's a lot of different sort of things to be keeping track of. And then there was 1 teacher, special ed teacher, who taught a self-contained classroom, grades K through 5, for students considered to have significant disabilities. So they had 5 adults supporting a multitude of classrooms and students before they switched to an inclusive model. And so what they did after they shifted to an inclusive model was they took their same 5 people, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 special ed teachers still, and they restructured. So this teacher was K1, this teacher was grade 2, this teacher was grade 3, this teacher was grade 4, and this teacher was grade 5. And so now they have the same 5 teachers. One still had to service 2 grade levels, but everyone else is now in the same grade, right? So they're just thinking about differentiating 1 grade level content. And they used 1 paraprofessional with each grade so that, with the exception of the K1 teacher, there was 2 paraprofessionals. So the teacher could plan differentiated supports for students, right? And essentially at all times, the gen ed teacher had either the support of the paraprofessional or the special education teacher. So they would alternate which classroom that they were in. So there was full day coverage for each of the classrooms to now provide all of the service delivery in inclusive ways where students remained in the classroom. So this was just to show sort of that restructuring. Oftentimes I hear it's going to cost way more money. We're going to need way more people. And this is just one example of how we took 5 teachers and restructured them instead of having sort of students being pulled all over the place to now being supported within their classrooms with their peers. And this was just this is one set of data. There was a lot of other data connected to this particular school, but we can also see here some of the impacts in terms of the educational performance of students at the school before and then after 3 years later from their inclusive shift. So we see this is at proficient or above, right? Before they were in an inclusive model, 70% of students were at a proficient or above, and 3 years later, 98% were. Oh no, sorry, I'm on the wrong line. Percent of students tested. All students proficient or advanced, right? We have 50% were before and then 86. But then we see it also by race, and we see special education went from 13% at kind of proficient or advanced up to 60. So still not at 100, but making significant gains there.
We do have a very well-written question that came in, if I can interrupt.
Okay, great.
The question is, how do we effectively teach students who are not accessing the curriculum in the general education setting? Really looking for strategies to work on single-digit addition in a 4th grade with class where the students are learning about area models and multiplying multi-digit numbers, for example. How do we approach that?
That's a really great question. So there's a lot there to unpack. And Jess, I would be also happy to connect with you more after this. But in general, I think a lot of the access is about, 1, how do we break stuff down and sort of break it down, right, into kind of chunked accessible pieces, right, for students who may be accessing at a different entry point, right? And then building in opportunities for them to also sort of practice the things that they are working on in conjunction with what's happening. So I've seen a lot of teachers who are breaking down math content kind of into the component pieces, right? And then a student is working on that addition. And so they're supporting them in kind of how to do what we're doing, but then building in the addition steps for them to be practicing that skill that they're working on as well. The idea being that they're getting access to what's happening in grade level. A lot of times we don't know how much students are picking up from being in a classroom, right? So in an inclusive approach, we want students to still have access to the grade level content. And then we also still want to be supporting them in those skills that they are working on. So a lot of it, I think, is about how you can break it down and build in that practice of the particular things that they're working on, while still thinking about how to create access to the larger concepts and ideas. A lot of teams I work with also think a lot about sort of that prioritized, or there's a lot of names for it, right? But that big idea curriculum. So out of the 4th grade thing where they're working on area models, for example, right? Like what might be the key things we want that student to really know broadly about area models, and then we're working on that bigger picture thing, maybe not as many details or nuances from some of their grade level peers. We're also then building in that practice as they're working through their steps on the single digit addition. I don't know if that answers your question very well in this very short amount of time, but I would be totally happy to connect on that and have a lot of ideas. Math is particularly tricky because math tends to have a really particular scope and sequence and goes in very particular ways. So I very much appreciate that question. And I always think of it as sort of an both and. How do we give them access, accessible content connected to that grade level content and curriculum, and how do we build in practice of the things that they're individually working on as well, and in ways that they can kind of do it within the flow of the classroom. Yes, great question. Okay. Oh my gosh, we're at 4:30. Okay, so I know we are out of time very quickly here. Just wanted to let you all know we do have some great special education classes coming up here at PSU in the spring, summer, and fall. If anyone is interested in learning more, we have classes this spring, one thinking about the legal and ethical issues of working with families and children. We have another great class on language and learning disability. This summer, we have a classroom related to classroom strategies, special education law, tech for diverse learners, and language and learning disability is being offered again. And then in the fall, we also have a class on curriculum development in special education. We have a class on autism and spectrum disorders. We have another class on behavior disorders in school-age children. So if anyone is looking for some more coursework connected to supporting students with disabilities, we have a lot of great things coming up. We also have more professional development opportunities being offered by myself and a variety of my colleagues connected to education here at PSU, being offered across this spring semester. They're free for educators. You're more than welcome to come and join us. We have some related to supporting ELLs. I'm doing classes on UDL differentiation and adaptations. I'm doing one on the fundamentals of co-teaching and collaboration. And I'm also doing one on supporting students with challenging behavior in the general education inclusive setting. So there's a lot there. The website, we can put that in the chat, I think, for everyone, if anyone would like to check those out. But there's a ton of opportunities, so feel free to check those out and come and join us. Otherwise, I really appreciate you being here today. My email is there, and Jeremy, I will turn it back to you.
No, we thank you very much for all the work that you did speaking with us today. We are so very thankful for that. We would love to remind the rest of you, hopefully you enjoyed this webinar. It's our third in a series of 4. We hope you might consider attending Dr. Kate Murphy's talk coming up later in April 3rd at 3:30 p.m. And that particular talk is titled, at the moment, although that may change, managing student mental health while navigating social media. So that should be a good one. Look out for that. If you were on the list for this particular webinar, you likely will be on the list for the next one too. We do very much hope that you enjoyed it, and thank you so very, very much.